Welcome to episode 723 of People Behind the Science. I'm Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are looking forward to re-sharing our interview with Dr. John Kress, originally released on October 30th of 2017. Listeners, John is an accomplished botanist and author of multiple popular science books. He spent much of his career studying the past and present plants in the tropics and how plants and animals interact in tropical areas. In our conversation, John shares candid stories from his life and research, and I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the People Behind the Science podcast. Today, I am excited to introduce you all to Dr. John Kress. So, John, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm fine. It's a beautiful day here in Washington, and I'm a lover of the fall season, so I'm really glad to see it here.
Well, I am a fan of fall as well, and I must say it's a gorgeous day here in St. Louis as well. So,
all right, great.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us today, and I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So, listeners, John is a distinguished scientist and curator of botany at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. In addition, John is the author of multiple popular science books, including Plant Conservation, A Natural History Approach, The Weeping Goldsmith, Discoveries in the Secret Land of Myanmar, The Ornaments of Life, Coevolution and Conservation in the Tropics, DNA Barcodes, Methods and Protocols, and most recently, he's editor of the book Living in the Anthropocene, Earth in the Age of Humans. John received his bachelor's degree in biology from Harvard University and his PhD in botany from Duke University. John formerly served as the Interim Undersecretary for Science for the Smithsonian Institution, Executive Director of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, as well as Director of the Consortium for Understanding and Sustaining a Biodiverse Planet, which is one of the 4 grand challenges of the Smithsonian Institution Strategic Plan. He is also Chairman of the Board of the Organization for Tropical Studies, or OTS, as well as an affiliate faculty member at George Mason University. John has previously served as an adjunct professor at George Washington University, as well as the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Among John's awards and honors are receipt of the Parker Gentry Award for Biodiversity and Conservation from the Field Museum of Natural History, the Lifetime Achievement Award from Heliconia Society International, as well as the Edward O. Wilson Biodiversity Technology Pioneer Award for co-development of LeafSnap, the first mobile app for plant identification. John is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as well as an honorary fellow of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. And John, today we want to get to know more about you as a scientist, an author, and as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not very busy at work?
I'm kind of a science guy, to tell you the truth. And even when I'm not here in the lab at the Smithsonian or in the herbarium looking at plant specimens, I love to be out in nature. So on my weekends and in the evening, I take a lot of time to take walks and hikes with my wife and my dog, finding new places around the Washington area or outside the Washington area. I kind of always just like to see nature in action and try to understand how it works. So even though I'm not in the lab, I'm still doing science in a way.
Certainly. So being a distinguished botanist, do you find it hard to turn it off, maybe as you're going on walks and hikes, to be identifying all the plants and thinking about them that way?
I guess I do. I just bring my binoculars along and my hand lens and look at everything that flies and walks and is growing there. I'm also actually very interested in gardening, so raising plants, and I find I learn a lot from just watching things, particularly plants, grow.
So what's your favorite thing to grow in the garden?
Believe it or not, in Washington here, I can grow gingers and bananas.
Really?
Which are 2 of my research specialties. So I can actually study the plants I'm growing in my backyard.
Very cool. Well, John, wonderful to hear more about life outside of science, but I do want to chat about your work next. So can you tell us how you describe what you do to someone who might not be familiar with the Smithsonian or not familiar with botany?
I guess the most easy way to think about it is exploring the natural world and all the organisms that make up the natural world. And that actually includes humans to a certain extent because they're part of the natural world, although not as integral a part as I'd like to see. But essentially, since I was a graduate student, I've been out exploring particularly tropical areas on all continents to find out what's growing there, what possibly grew there in the past, and also how the plants and animals are interacting in their natural environments.
Very cool. Well, I love chatting about what motivates scientists as they go through their endeavors. So, John, do you have a particular favorite motivational quote or a saying or a force that really keeps you going in every day?
I probably don't have one that's my favorite, although I think I would say, if at first you don't succeed, try again. I think that's maybe a motto of a lot of scientists because we're always experimenting with things, and experiments never work the first time. So by default, we're always trying things again. And it's the same with observing nature. Seeing something once is really never enough. You have to see it several times. So trying again, I think, is probably one of the mottos that I do follow in my work and in my life.
I like it. It's one of my favorite as well. I think you haven't failed until you've given up. Everything else is just a learning experience.
There you go. Exactly.
So, John, tell us a little bit about some of the people who might have motivated or inspired you throughout your career, or maybe as you started your journey into science.
That's a really good question, Marie. I think my mentors as an undergraduate student at Harvard probably were some of the most important people in my life. There are three that come to mind immediately. One is one of the greatest living biologists today, Edward O. Wilson, who's an emeritus professor at Harvard right now. I took his basic biology course and just fell in love with hearing him talk about how important biology is to the function of the planet and how we best can understand it. And I'm still in touch with him today. The second was another professor at Harvard, Richard Evans Schultes, who studied plants and people. And his career was all focused on the Amazon and understanding how indigenous people there use the plants around them. And he inspired me, actually, to go into field ecology and field biology. And I was fortunate to take my first trip to the tropics with Professor Schultes. So he was number two. And number three was a student of his at the time, a graduate student named Timothy Plowman, who went on to get a PhD. And I took my second trip, an extended trip of plant collecting in Peru with Tim. And that just kind of opened up a whole new world of understanding the natural world and how we relate to it. So I think those three are really inspirational scientists for me.
Certainly. Now, there are certain traits that these scientists exude that you really kind of took to and tried to incorporate into your own approach?
Definitely. And one of them was maybe try again. Mm-hmm. When you're in the field and you're up a river or at the end of a road or hiking a mountain trail, looking for things that you expect to be there, when you don't find them, you could either turn around or you can keep going until you find them. And I think all three of those people were instrumental to me to keep going and explore further and further and further. So that was a trait that I learned early on.
Wonderful. Well, great to hear about some of the people who inspired you on your own path in science. But Don, I'm curious to hear how this path began or where it all began. So do you have a particular memory of your first moment getting excited about science?
Yes, Marie. Actually, when I started as an undergraduate, I had an aspiration of being on the stage and being a dramatic actor.
Really?
I kind of started that when I was in high school, and I thought, well, this is what I want to do. And I went to college and found out that that was not what I wanted to do very, very rapidly.
What convinced you that it wasn't?
Well, I got up on the stage.
Yeah.
And realized it was not the place for me. Even though I had done a lot of it, the more I got into it, I just wanted something different. In fact, the stage was always kind of play acting, if I could put it that way. And I felt that I really wanted something real. And that's when I turned to biology and particularly botany, because to me, that was something I could hold in my hand that was, at that point, appeared to be infinite. I had all the stuff to learn. So I did turn to biology, particularly evolutionary biology. And I mentioned the people that were inspirational to me and just kept on that track. Went on, got a PhD at Duke, did a postdoc, had an early position at a botanical garden in Florida, and then came to the Smithsonian. And there could not be a better place to explore the world than the Smithsonian. So I was really lucky to have that career path.
Certainly. I find it humorous that you mentioned that kind of getting up on stage was the tipping point on your scale of whether to pursue that career in acting, because as a scientist, I'm sure you find that you're on stage in front of audiences and speaking to people quite a bit. So is that something that you enjoy or something that you've kind of learned to live with in your career?
I love it. I really do. I love it in a different way than when I was aspiring to be an actor, because I'm talking about things that have happened in my life, observations I've made about nature, and it becomes very personal. So I think that early inspiration has translated into my ability to communicate to the public and other scientists.
Do you think some of that early acting training was helpful too?
I do, particularly in just enunciating and looking people in the eye when you are talking to them and things like that.
Excellent. So now communicating with the public and kind of bridging that gap between scientists and the public is a big part of what the Smithsonian does. So can you talk a little bit about what it's like working at the Smithsonian and engaging in both research and communicating with the public?
Sure. Many of my colleagues that got PhDs and kept on in science, they aspired to go on to university positions where they were kind of training professional students. But I always really liked the idea. I mean, I like mentoring other young scientists, but I also did like the idea of interacting with the public. So that's why I've focused my entire career on either botanic gardens, which are open to the public, or museums such as the Smithsonian. And you have to learn to speak in a kind of a different way to non-scientists. And I like that challenge. And I think the more opportunity you have at a place like the Smithsonian, really the better you can get. Now, it's not just talking to the public, but it's also developing exhibits, figuring out ways to get people that aren't necessarily scientists excited in science and biology and plants and the tropics and climate change and all those sorts of things. And the Smithsonian certainly opened up a whole new world of opportunities for me to do those things. So as I said, it's been great.
Absolutely. So do you find it's hard to balance all the different hats that you wear and the responsibilities that you have working there?
Yes, I do.
Fair.
That, if I can say it in that way. Fortunately, there are a lot of other scientists here, for example, in the Natural History Museum. So it's not all on my shoulders by any means. And we have a lot of great communicators. So I feel like I can best communicate science to non-specialists by doing science myself. So I've always tried to balance the actual doing science, as I say, in the field or in the lab, with talking about science to public.
Certainly. And if there are listeners out there who are interested in maybe getting involved with this type of institution, either as just a member of the general public or maybe aspiring scientists who are interested in working at a place like this eventually, what advice do you have for them?
Understand that there is a diversity of ways to reach the public at a natural history museum. You don't have to be a scientist. You could, if you have a background in science, but you're more interested in design, you could get involved in designing exhibits, or you can get involved in publications that come out of museums, or you can get involved in being assistants to scientists and the public education processes. There's all kinds of things you can do. You can get into public relations. A background in science really prepares you to do all those different things. So you don't have to be kind of on the front line of doing science to actually be able to reach the public in natural history museums.
Certainly. Well, we've chatted a little bit about the different steps you took on your career path, and I'm curious to hear about when writing kind of fit into that. And I know I mentioned in the introduction here that you're an author of a number of different books for the public, so that's another way that you communicate with them. When did your interest in writing start?
I think it also started in college. And when I switched from drama to biology, I've always been a person that keeps a personal journal of things that happen to me on a daily basis, wherever I happen to be, encounters with people, encounters with plants, encounters with habitats, encounters with animals, and not just science observations, but also person-to-person's observations. So I've always done a lot of writing for myself just to remind me of things that happened in my life. But then as a scientist, 50% of being a scientist is communication, and most of that communication is through publication. So scientists are always writing. Maybe when I finally got to the Smithsonian, I started also trying to communicate with non-scientists, maybe because of my responsibilities to interact with the public here. But it wasn't until I wrote a book, it was published in 2009, so not that long ago, on my experiences collecting plants in the country of Myanmar in Southeast Asia. I spent about 10 years working there on and off, and was so taken with the country, both its people and its culture, its religion, its plants. I felt like I really needed to write a full-length book on what it was like to be in that country, because it was such an unknown country and so few people had been there, and it was isolated and it was secret. So I wrote that book, The Weeping Goldsmith, about my experiences to tell people about this country, but also to try to relate what a natural history scientist does at the Smithsonian.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to give people an idea of what the career is like, what your kind of day-to-day work is like, and what you're doing. So I think that's an awesome idea for a book. And we've chatted about some of the great aspects of your career, John, so far, but we haven't yet really delved into some of the challenges and frustrations. And I know they are there for every scientist, and I love sharing them with our listeners so they can get a realistic and holistic view of the life of a scientist and what you do every day. So do you have a favorite story, John, of failure or challenge that you want to share with our listeners today?
Well, I have a lot.
Dig out the diaries. Yeah.
Dig out the journals, exactly. That's the try again part of it. Mm-hmm. But I think if I could go back to the country of Myanmar, I mean, when I as a scientist go to a country, whether it's Colombia, Ecuador, China, Kenya, Myanmar, Thailand, we always encounter different cultures, different politics, different economies, and each one of those is a different experience, presented with a lot of challenges and you have to overcome. Developing colleagues in these countries is probably number one, because we never work in a country without our local colleagues. We're there working alongside, also training when we can and being trained by them. But sometimes you run up against roadblocks that seem as insurmountable challenges. And Myanmar was one of those, since it had been a country isolated from Western scientists for so long. Trying to do science and finding good partners in that country was a very difficult task. And I would spend days and weeks in the capital city of Rangoon, just going from one office to the next, meeting this person and that person, trying to get permission to go out in the countryside and work with their scientists and discover new things, since it had not explored in such a long time. I and a number of people almost gave up, because for my time, it was just too much for me to be spending all this time not being productive in terms of data gathering. But I persisted, and I eventually prevailed, and feel like working in that country was one of the most important experiences of my career.
What do you think ultimately contributed to things turning around and you becoming successful and getting out there and being able to work?
Getting to know people.
Okay.
And spending a lot of time just talking with them, joking with them, finding out about their interests and their experiences, and building a certain amount of trust that then there became no question that all of this was a very positive thing, that everybody had something to gain, and things then started moving forward.
So I know as a field scientist, a lot of things come up and you can't prepare for everything. Is there a particular field memory that you have of when you ran into a challenge or unexpected roadblock or something that you really had to figure out how to work around?
Well, one of those, again, not to focus too much on Myanmar, but I did have a lot of experiences there. One of those was taking a long 4-day hike with some foresters through the countryside with elephants and such things, and getting to the final day of our expedition, heading back, and one of the foresters collecting some wild plants for our lunch as we were about to go out. We had a great lunch, but it turned out he collected the wrong things, and we had all ingested a pretty large helping of hallucinogenic plants that we thought were something else.
Oh, no.
And suddenly nobody could walk, nobody could drive. We were all sicker than dogs. And since we all had sat down and had the lunch, there was nobody
to help you out.
Really to help. That was a pretty harrowing experience, since we didn't really know what it was. And afterwards, we figured out what was mixed up. But it took us about 48 hours to recover from that. And it was a little frightening.
Oh, my goodness.
So those are the sorts of challenges that you can't predict, but they do happen.
And they highlight the importance of plant identification.
They do.
Right.
They do. And that forester got a good talking to afterwards. So,
Well, wonderful to hear about some of your challenges and how you work through them. But John, we don't just want to talk about the difficult times. I'd love to chat about some of your successes. So do you have a favorite story of success you can share, whether it's big or small?
Big, I'd say, although it took a while to accomplish, but it was big. And that was convincing the Smithsonian Institution to actually make a bold statement about climate change. The institution had not done that for a while. And when I was interim undersecretary for science, I had a heart-to-heart talk with the secretary of the institution, and I was leading a group on climate change. And we had been saying the Smithsonian has to take a stand on this. Other federal agencies had done this, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, And the Smithsonian generally likes to walk a pretty neutral line on things. But since we are a science and a knowledge-based institution, I felt that it was important to do that. And the secretary was extremely receptive after we had long discussions about it, and so was everybody else in the institution. And even the Board of Regents approved this statement on the science of climate change, and it was effectively published. So that was a pretty big achievement.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on that big achievement. How did you, position it to get it to the point where they finally were convinced?
Well, we just talked about reality and truth and facts.
Mm-hmm.
We have many scientists here at the Smithsonian, from our paleobiologists who are studying the history of changing climates and environments on the planet, to our tropical scientists that are looking at the impacts of rising temperatures on systems in Panama and other places, to our astrophysical observatory in Cambridge that are studying the changes in our atmosphere with the increase of CO2. So there was no denying by any of our science that this was all happening. And it was just a matter of kind of gathering together all of these, I don't want to call them stories, though they are stories in a way, that we had an obligation to bring this out and make sure that the public, our constituents, knew that the Smithsonian was doing this. So it happened.
Certainly. And I think this is a big driver behind the recently published book that you're an editor of, The Living in the Anthropocene, The Earth and the Age of Humans. So can you talk a little bit about how this book came about?
Yes, Marie, it was fascinating. I was dealing mostly with scientists in thinking about environmental change and climate change. But then I realized, talking to some of my colleagues in other museums at the Smithsonian, particularly Jeffrey Stein, who's the co-editor on this book, who's a historian of environmental sciences, that there were a lot of scholars here at the Smithsonian interested in the impacts of a changing world on whatever their specialty was, whether it was art, whether it was history, whether it was economics. All these things are being impacted by these changes in temperature, changes in environment, changes to the planet, the amount of plastic on the planet now. We have people studying how plastic degrades over time. So we pulled together a group that we called the Living in the Anthropocene group, and we would meet every 2 weeks and talk about the impact of these major changes happening to the planet on our everyday lives. So Jeffrey and I said, we need to record this because there's so many different perspectives. So we put together a list of both scholars within the Smithsonian and scholars outside the Smithsonian that we knew that we thought had important opinions and observations and perspectives on climate change. And lo and behold, a year and a half later, out popped the book, Living in the Anthropocene, Earth in the Age of Humans.
Definitely. And I do really like that, like you said, it incorporates all these different perspectives. It brings together information about the air, the land, the ocean effects, as well as race and culture and art, all these different things. So it's really accessible and engaging for a wide audience.
It really is. And we specifically didn't want long, endless papers by each of these scholars. We asked them to be succinct, to submit 1,200 words, no more.
Which is hard, yeah.
Which is really hard. In fact, that was maybe the hardest thing they all had, was trying to really focus on what their message was to be. Mm-hmm. But they all did it, and I think the book really will give anyone, whether they're scientists or not, a really good perspective on what climate change and the change to the planet mean to us as people living on it.
Certainly. And on the topics of books, we'll definitely put this on our website for our listeners to find as a recommendation. But John, do you have other books that you've read and really enjoyed that you want to recommend to our listeners?
Sure. I've got a few. Again, I think most of them are science-oriented, even though some of them are not written by science. There's a great book called The Wild Places by a British author who tried to find spots in the United Kingdom where people had never been. Just trying to find wild places, whether they're on the coast, whether they're in moors, whether they're in the mountains. And he couldn't find any places that people had never been to in the UK.
Wow.
And it was fascinating for him to kind of take you as a reader of the book on his own little expeditions to find these places. He talks about the history of these places and what he found there as somebody that maybe had been to a place that hadn't been visited for several hundred years. So it's a really neat book. It's called The Wild Places.
Excellent. Well, I will add that to our list as well. Were there any others you wanted to mention?
One other that, again, is kind of an egghead book in a way, but it's not. It's a book by a fellow named Donald Peaty called A Natural History of Trees. And he was in the Forest Department here in the U.S., He died a number of years ago, but has written a wonderful book. They're, again, short little essays, vignettes of tree species across North America. And I read that book and I could not stop reading because every tree that he describes is better than the tree he just described.
Really?
Yeah, and it's not just egghead science about the trees. It's just his appreciation of the leaves and the fruits and how the animals in the forest use these trees and how people use these trees and how they've always used them and what's happening to them. And it's just a wonderful collection of essays about our native trees. So anybody that's interested in that, I certainly would recommend looking at that book.
Fantastic. I will add that to the list as well. I'm curious now, John, do you have a favorite tree or plant species yourself?
Yes, I do. And it happens to be one that I discovered as a new species in the country of Myanmar. And when we go looking for new species of plants as scientists at the Smithsonian, we usually, as I said earlier, we go to the end of the road, we go up a river, we climb a mountain, trying to find places where people haven't been looking for new species. This one I found in the market in Rangoon. I didn't have to even leave the city.
That's wonderful.
And it was a plant that the local people called the Weeping Goldsmith, which is the title of the book that I wrote about it. And it turned out it's a beautiful flower in the ginger family, and it's used as an offering in all the Buddhist temples throughout Myanmar. And it was a species new to science. Nobody had ever described it before. So it's kind of a symbol to me that we can find new things everywhere or anywhere you look. And that plant, it's also really a beautiful looking flower. So it's one of my favorites.
That's really cool. Hidden in plain sight. It's amazing that it was an offering used everywhere.
Yep.
I think throughout our conversation, we've chatted about some of your travel opportunities you've had in your job as a scientist and working at the Smithsonian. And I think this is an amazing part of the job that many people may not realize comes with it. So, John, do you have a favorite place that you've traveled for science?
I think the Amazon of South America is one of my two most favorite places. The Amazon, because it's endless, although we know it's not endless. We know that's a big issue right now. But when I go there, I mean, I could go down the Amazon or the Rio Negro for hours and see forests. So it's a spectacular place for a botanist. And the other is right up the road from the Amazon, which is the Andes of South America. Just a wonderful mountain chain that goes down the backbone all the way from Venezuela down to Argentina. And there's many things to discover there. And I've traveled, particularly in the country of Colombia, for weeks on end through the Andes, looking for new species of plants and finding wonderful little villages and wonderful people and wonderful plants in that area. So I think the Andes and the Amazon are two of my favorite spots.
Wonderful. Now, do you still get to travel to do field research in these places?
I do, not so much these days. I'm kind of reaching the synthetic part of my career, if I can put it that way, in which I've gathered so much data over the last 35 years that I really am taking more time to synthesize those data to come out with some new ideas about how biodiversity works and how plants and animals evolve. So I'm kind of limiting my time a little bit on field work and trying to do more writing and synthesize.
Absolutely. I imagine you collect an overwhelming amount of data every trip you go, so it, I'm sure, accumulates.
That's true. I should also mention, Marie, that it's not just being in the field. We now also have a lot of lab work going on here at the Smithsonian. Obviously, you've heard of DNA and genomics and such things, and that's a big part of our discovery. So many of us are also leading lives in the laboratory as well as out in the field. Particularly a lot of the young scientists are turning to discovering about life and such things by doing DNA sequencing and things. So that's another big part of natural history research.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful to hear about some of the places that your science has taken you. And we've chatted a little bit about some of the people who had a big impact on you, particularly in the early stages of your career as an undergraduate at Harvard. But I think the people are also part of what makes science so wonderful. And there are stereotypes out there about what scientists are like, but I love to break those on our program by showing a different side of scientists and the work that we do. So do you have a particular, maybe quirky tradition that you've experienced, John, or a fun or funny memory that you've shared with colleagues that really highlights this human side of science?
One experience or one thing I did that some may think was humorous, others may not. But when we go out in the field as explorers and scientists looking for new plants and animals, some of us get a little puffed up about how good we are at finding this and finding that. And I was at a field station one time working with a taxonomist who was there collecting poisonous snakes. It's not my cup of tea. I'd rather eat the poisonous plants than look for the poisonous snakes.
Right. I'm with you there.
Yeah, definitely. But he was always suggesting what a dangerous job he had and how brave he was to go out and find these snakes and all that. He was, but one night I heard he was going to go out with his headlamp looking for snakes with a bunch of students. So I just couldn't resist. I had in my kit an inflatable snake about 6 feet long.
You just happened to have it.
Well, I won't go into the reason why I had this, but so I snuck out before dinner where I knew he'd be going down this trail, and I blew up the snake and I hid it in the bushes, knowing that he would be heading down that trail, and then quietly went back to the field station. And later on, I heard the big struggle he had collecting that inflatable fake snake that he found along.
It's a new species, right?
It was a new species, definitely. But anyway, he got back and he knew it was me. And after his anger subsided, we laughed about it. That's the fun we have when we're in the field.
Did he get back at you with a fake plant stuck somewhere?
Oh, many times.
Very cool. Well, wonderful to hear one of these stories that you've shared with scientists. I think it shows a little bit the sense of humor. You're doing serious work, but you can have fun while you're doing it.
Yeah, we do. But some things are fun, and joking with the snake was fun, but it's often long days of traveling and long days of hiking and not great accommodation and food and things. So it's tough, but it's also extremely rewarding. And I think that's why all of us do it.
Absolutely. And for students who are interested in doing field work, but maybe have never done it before, are there certain things that you can do to help prepare them for the conditions they're going to go through?
You have to have a lot of latitude in what you'll tolerate. You have to be in good shape physically. Mm-hmm. You don't want to get stuck out somewhere and not be in good shape to take a long walk out or a swim out or whatever. And that's not always the case, but you can get in situations like that. You also have to have a pretty easygoing personality to get along with a lot of people. So those are some things you can prepare for, some things that are just either you got it or you don't.
Well, aspiring field biologists out there, it's time to hit the gym, and then we can contemplate our long walks and treks.
Mm-hmm. But, most people that do go into this type of science, Marie, are pretty fit and are interested in nature and are interested in physical stamina and such things. So that's not a problem for field biologists.
Certainly. You've been doing it your whole life, going out and doing treks in the woods.
I think I have.
Very cool. So now we've chatted about some different aspects of your work, John, and I'm curious, if I gave you everything, because usually there's something standing in the way between you and being able to do everything you'd like. So if we took all the barriers out of the way, John, and if you had all of the funding and staff and technology, whatever feasibility needs you had, all of that taken care of, what is the one question that you most want to answer?
Can you really do that? Can you take all those barriers away?
Well, we'll see. Depends on your question. No.
What I've been thinking about a lot recently, and as I mentioned earlier about synthesizing things, is trying to understand how complex nature really is. And I'm thinking about how not necessarily internal complexity in terms of physiology and such things, how an organism works, but how organisms function in their natural environments. And along with a number of scientists, recently I've been studying plant-animal interactions, and particularly the networks of interactions that go on in a particular habitat. For example, the rainforest of Costa Rica, where we're doing a project right now. We can count up all the species, let's say in a hectare of forest, whether they're insects or plants or birds or mammals or frogs, and we can get some idea about how complex biodiversity is. But that is a great underestimate of the complexity of nature, because all of those species, the plants, the animals, the insects, they're all interacting in a myriad number of ways, whether they're pollinating each other, whether they're eating each other, whether they're dispersing the fruits and the seeds. And it's that complexity of interactions that we have such a poor understanding. So if I had infinite resources and infinite people to work with me, I would try to describe and uncover that complexity of nature.
I like it. And to make matters even maybe worse and more complicated, these things aren't static, right? They're dynamic. They're changing. We're having an effect on them.
You bet. And that's part of what we're studying also. I mean, the little we know about the complexity, now all that complexity is changing. For example, we're doing a project on plants and the insects that eat them in Costa Rica, and we're seeing that because of the increasing temperatures, both the plants and the animals are moving up the mountainside to get to cooler habitats, or not cooler, to stay at the same temperatures they've evolved in. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to figure out, do they move in the same rate? Do they move at the same time? What happens if the insects move faster than the plants? Do they switch hosts? But it is changing. It's all changing out there.
And a difficult question to answer. I don't think I can give you everything today to fix all those problems, John.
Okay. Well,
unfortunately.
But that is what I'm thinking about.
I like it. Well, thanks for dreaming big with us today, John. And we've talked about some different aspects of your career. And I think advice from a person at different stages of your career can make all the difference sometimes. So I love giving our guests an opportunity to give our listeners out there advice. So is there one piece of advice that really helped you at some point that you want to pass on to them today?
I think, and this is for scientists and non-scientists, it's really get to know nature and biodiversity while you can. Whether it's species that are alive today or habitats that are there today, never take it for granted that it's going to be there tomorrow, because we know chances are it's not going to be there tomorrow. It may move somewhere else, or it may even go extinct. So do it while you can and don't put it off. We know that life is what makes planet Earth unique in the entire universe. So seeing and understanding nature and life right now could not be more important. So that's my advice to everybody.
I like it. An excellent call to action there, John. Is there any other last piece of advice you'd like to give them, or a last note of inspiration you want to leave them with today?
Well, I've been talking about change and climate change and the Smithsonian's climate change statement and all this and what we have to pay attention to. But I'm a little worried, but I'm not too worried just yet. I think if we open our eyes and we pay attention to what's happening and each of us discovers what's going on in terms of change around them, we have a high probability of fixing some of the major problems of the planet right now. But again, we can't wait too long. We've got to get out there and we've got to act pretty fast.
A note of hope there. That's wonderful. And I think so much of what you hear sort of is tainted with this idea of doom and gloom, and there's nothing you can do about it now, which makes it hard to get people motivated to act. So I think that's really helpful to get that message out there that there are still things we can do. We can still turn things around.
Definitely. And you have to be realistic about this, though. I don't want to be unrealistic and say there's no problems. There's plenty of problems, but I do think that if we act and we act soon, we can solve those problems.
Excellent. Well, wonderful message to leave our listeners with today, John. Can you tell them if they want to learn more about you and what you do, or if they have any questions, how can they reach you, or where should they go to look?
I'd be happy to answer anybody that wants to send me an email. My email address is kressj@si.edu. I'm your public servant, so I'm happy to talk to anybody that would like to discuss nature or biodiversity. You also can check out the Smithsonian website. There's a lot of information on there about what we do as scientists and scholars, and a lot about the Smithsonian itself. So there's two ways that they can get in touch.
Wonderful. Well, listeners, definitely check out the website and learn more about John's work and what's going on at the Smithsonian. And definitely email John if you have any questions. And John, thank you so much for joining us on the program today and sharing a piece of your own story.
Maria, I really appreciate your questions and having an opportunity to talk to your audience.
Well, it was a pleasure to have you with us today. And listeners, wonderful to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.